So we are kicking off with the next rendition of our AMAs. This time we're featuring our lovely head of ecosystem over at Miston Labs. I'll actually hand over the mic for Koh to speak.
Sure thing. So my name is Koh Kim. For people who don't know what I really do at Miston, but I have all of our partnerships, marketing, everything external facing for Miston is kind of under my purview. The stream does include Jen and the marketing team. So I'm kind of thinking a lot about how do we grow communities? How do we get builders to bring cool experiences to our platform? And then how do we enable the broader community to learn and become great developers and kind of evangelize kind of the Web3 movement. But I guess about myself, my story is a bit interesting. So we start all the way from university, carry all the way for university, which is actually where I met Jen, which we will put aside for another day, actually, or maybe we'll talk about it later if people are very curious. But, I actually had the intention of becoming a PhD in economics. I was actually studying game theory and applied statistics. And so, which also was I guess it has something to do with things right now. So pretty much was on this path for PhD. And then I think one of my professors was you know what, you should go into the real world. And I was okay, because they're academia is always going to be here. You should go check out the real world. I think he was secretly telling me I was too social to be in academia. So I went, and actually my first internship ever was helping technology partners at Microsoft. I don't know if anyone remembers Motorola and the Razr phone, which will absolutely date me now. But yeah, so I was handling a lot for Motorola, a lot of the technology, hardware and software partnerships, really looking forward on hey, 10 years from now how is technology going to really affect our products? Because they work on these 5 to 10 year product pipelines. And so back then I was you really should think about video, your best camera is always going to be the one on you. And so really think about your camera technology and all that. And I think at the end of that summer, that's when Google actually acquired YouTube. So I guess probably some signs showing up since then. So since then, my career has kind of started out from quantitative marketing. So really kind of using data to identify new consumer demand and kind of create products to fit those new consumer segments. And then I actually went to Google later instead of business school. Yeah. And then at the time, I actually started off as a product marketer within Google for the Chrome team. And the product VP that I was closely working with was Sundar Pichai, who was now the current CEO of Alphabet. So I had really great mentors back then, and then moved a lot into partnerships, really focused on Google's new and emerging platforms. So I've probably launched at least 4 new platforms during my time. Not every launches went well, but what I was really known for was for scaling Google Play games business. And so I actually that's the app store, the mobile app store for the Android ecosystem. And then from that, I actually scaled out a lot of our international teams, especially in Asia, and really focused on the gaming world. And so that's kind of when I really cut my teeth into the gaming side. And for some of you that probably knows a little bit or have done a little bit of diligence, I also do angel invest and advise a lot of consumer companies, especially in the gaming space. And even most recently, a lot of these gaming companies went into Web3. So I actually helped as an advisor on the go-to-market community building strategy for a lot of these Web3 projects, including Panzer Dogs, which is on Solana, GameX, also on Solana, which I think they've both sold out their respective initial NFT mints. And then there's numerous other companies like Azure Games, which headed up by Marco Terra, that's led by Andreas Horowitz, and then there's a few more companies and stuff. And here I am at Miston because I was all signs are pointing towards my jump into Web3, and what better place than here at this company and here for Sui. Jen, did that sufficiently cover it?
Yes, it does. In case people are wondering, she is the ecosystems, partnerships, and marketing overlord, and yes, I do report to her. So it's interesting that I get to also interview my boss while this is all happening. So if you have fun questions that you want me to ask, I am happy to be the voice piece. As a quick rule, if you just know that this is being simulcast both on our Discord as well as our Twitter Spaces. So preference-wise, we wanted to make sure that it was accessible for different channels. So please make sure to tag us either on Twitter @reply or event chat on Discord and put in your questions. I know that not everyone had time to submit, so we're happy to make sure that when we have time at the end that we leave some room to have those questions asked. So without further delay, there's a lot of connected questions that are opening up around Sui Gaming. So I'll actually kind of explain the 2 connected questions, then we'll dive into the first part, Koh. So why should games build on Sui? And also, do you know your competitors and what advantage Sui has over our competitors? Why don't we dive into the first question of why should games build on this platform?
Okay, so why should games build on Sui? I think it's It's my audio is not working.
It's the fun world of being a globally distributed team. By the way, I'm dialing in from London and my lovely boss is dialing in from California. So with these technical mishaps, once again, we really appreciate how patient our lovely community has been while we try to get these AMAs off the ground. In the meantime, I'm happy to also just monitor through what's happening on our events chat and see if you guys have any questions that seem to pop up. Just to give you a preview of what to expect for our AMAs, it's not just about why games should be built on Sui. We received some really interesting questions about learning curve and accessibility barriers, especially if L2s are in the mix, because we also know that the barrier to entry in terms of gaming is kind of, sort of, really a pain in the ass. Fully aware of this. And we also know that in terms of future plans on game development around Sui, we received feedback about, are there plans in motion for an SDK release? Do we have any existing contact with marketplaces? How do we foresee creation and possibility of creation of mobile Android games? And when people say games, we're recognizing that it's not just web browser. I'm fully aware that people also are deeply concerned about it being an app that's accessible across like mobile as well. And there's some other mainstream related issues that gamers are facing. So how is blockchain gaming going to solve that? So those are some of the questions that we received as a preview. If you have other burning questions, once again, please don't hesitate to put it into our event chat or reply to us because we are happy to take on additional questions in the event that we have extra time. Sweet mother of God, we can hear you. It's a miracle. Okay.
So anyway, why should games build on Sui? So I actually advise a lot of these games. They actually have considered a lot of other chains. And so I actually have probably a pretty small sample size. But I think for one hand, I'd rather just go back. The question is about like, what are you trying to build as a game company or as any games team, right? You want to probably build a product. And if you think about all builders, game developers included, they're all kind of seeking fame and fortune. I mean, the reason why you're choosing a chain is based on, or any platform per se, is that you have a belief that you can achieve some sort of fame and fortune, fame being users, fortune being money. I know it's pretty deceptively simple, but it's true. And we all know games bring the users, and to some extent they do bring a lot of fortune to developers, depending on how successful or how fortunate you do get in terms of like building a user base and having an audience that really, really loves the game that they play. So the way to think about this is as they choose a platform, it's kind of like, and especially for Sui, like you want to build something that's going to be highly engaging, things that, give a reason for people to feel love, to feel power, and even to feel wealth to some extent, right? And I think what really matters from that is that if you think about all the actions and activities that a game tries to, or any product tries to do to make sure that they give a reason for the player to come back, it's really important to think about whether some of those actions can actually be represented on chain. So if you think about like a particular game, I'm going to go down the rabbit hole of MMORPGs, right? I don't know how many of you have played World of Warcraft or maybe Diablo or maybe MapleStory, but we'll choose any one of these games, right? So for those that are non-gamers, MMORPG stands for Massive Multiplayer Online Role-Playing Games. Essentially, you are building up a character that you usually personalize to your liking, and then you go on these many, many quests to basically build up experience points, game levels, collect equipment, collect gems, whatever it is. Usually there is no end, as we all know. It's just kind of like going on adventures with your buddies, right? So I think if you think about that world, right, really, really think about what happens. I think the question to think about is what happens when after you put in 1,000 hours and what gives, right? I mean, life happens, right? You maybe have a kid, maybe you just need a little bit different game, or maybe your social circle has kind of gone on and stopped playing other games. But what about all that time that was invested, right? Players' time is like very valuable. And the fact that you've chosen to compete for this leisure time then is like really important. So I think with that, there needs to be some ability, or at least in my mind, to kind of bring about like how to transfer the amount of time or get for people to recognize what that, to respect players' time invested into their game, and how can they give back that value to other players, right? Because there may be other players or new players that would love to experience the game, right? But they may not want to start from the beginning, or maybe their friends have already played to a certain point and then they didn't want to kind of put in the dedicated time, and they really just wanted to enjoy the game for the social experience rather than like just for being a completionist. So I think like with that, it brings in some interesting thoughts about like when people talk about ownership and engagement. investment, but it's really about how, as a game studio, should really think about pricing and valuing players' time, and then how that value should be exchanged across different areas. So I'm not going to really, I can talk about the technology too in one sense. I would be like, hey, like existing chains, they're just, built for payment records of banks. They were not really modeled to be assets designed on chain, because as you all know, assets like real estate change in value. And then if you look at Sui, right, this is the first time that assets are now modeled as objects, and then objects has attributes attached to it, in which that you can now model, like, let's say, a leveling up or experience points or augmentations that you did, and still have all of that record on chain, right? But I think when we think even beyond the game experience, running a game studio is a hard business. Like, I still have to post this very long video I've had. It was for my NFT NYC talk. But when you look at the traditional games business in one themselves, games as an application, consumer application, is one of the hardest things you can ever build. It's probably the most sophisticated, the most time consuming. And also, if you think about your addressable market to some extent, you're only targeting leisure time, right? You're not even targeting productivity time to some extent. But it's actually going to be one of the most competitive areas where you could be building. So the people who are building a game are really doing it because of the love of the craft. And also they really derive a lot of fulfillment from the enjoyment of users. And so I think with that is just thinking about the broader, what I call the industry ecosystem funnel. So as a new games team or any games team, right, how do I make a game that can be a business? Because in the end, a games company is a business, and you have to think through outside. First of all, making a game is hard enough, right? And then there's a lot of these tools that exist in order to make sure that this game works on multiple platforms, multiple devices, multiple geographies, can work with different bandwidth issues, all that stuff. That's just the game. Now we got to talk about everything outside of that, right? How does a game get distribution? And this is where the fame and fortune part really matters, because distribution in a lot of game companies is really hard. Even if you can distribute for free in the App Store, you still got to think about user acquisition, marketing costs. How are you going to get a player to realize that you exist? If you go find out how much gaming YouTubers get paid, the top gaming YouTubers make a lot of money, like a ton of money, because they can demand a lot of these prices. Look at Shroud, who can demand 6 figures in a sponsorship deal, right, for people to stream the new game. So if you think about an everyday game developer, there's a lot of barriers between you and the actual end player just to get the game in their hands and just to get them to try it. So I think a lot of the coolest opportunities for me is how do you equalize what I call the distribution side and the marketing side of the gaming arena, even in-game experience itself, because there's a lot of inefficiencies when it comes to marketing a game and acquiring a player and even making sure that they come back that I don't think a lot of people realize when it comes to payments, when it comes to marketing, all the ad networks you have to think about, all the advertising that you have to potentially do. Like, if you really think about it, there's a platform taking a cut of that. And if you think about the value of what is the percentage of money from $1 that actually reaches the game studio, it is going to be a lot lower than you think. So that's more of a general, I don't think it's build on Sui, but I think it's more of build on blockchain. But I think with Sui, you can model a lot more things that I think could really make a difference on the distribution.
Well, going on that, because yes, I think in general, it kind of creates a new paradigm in terms of why game studios should consider blockchain gaming as one of their models. But the other question that ties to this is, do we as Sui know our competitors, and what advantage do we at Sui have over our competitors?
So it's I have a personal belief, and then I have an objective belief. I think it depends on which opinion you want to hear.
Survey says we want both.
We want both? Okay. I will start with the personal belief, because that's just kind of a philosophy of marketing. I think we have no competitors. And I really do think it's because the technology we are implementing is kind of akin to dial-up versus broadband. If you think about the internet, especially internet infrastructure, right? A lot of dial-up. I don't know if any of you even remember dial-up. Most of you are probably way too young to remember this, to be honest. But I remember 28 kilobits, 56 kilobits per second over a phone line. So to some extent, I remember when the internet was so slow, when we have GeoCities websites, it was text RPGs. This was a very janky internet. But it was so magical because you can basically talk to someone from Sweden. There were a lot of really cool things I can do that was kind of outside of my original world. But you can imagine that if you're only having 26 kilobits per second, and mind you, if you have broadband, you will likely have 100 to 300 megabits per second. That is if I did my math right, at least 1000x faster than where the internet started from. The applications are very different. None of the applications you're using today on your mobile phone, and even Discord, would not be possible with the internet we've seen during the dial-up era. And that's kind of like where I see blockchain technology is right now, is we're in dial-up era. Like, there's a lot of things that are slow and kind of janky and kind of like things. And I think what's really excites me at Sui, and I think this is the biggest reason why I actually really wanted to work and build the ecosystems company, is because for the first time, I actually saw potential for broadband. And I think that's going to have a lot of interesting implications on what type of Web3 integrated applications and experiences we can have. So that's personal opinion. But let's look at objectively, because, business-minded person. I like to say I'm an optimistic realist. So if you look at like the front face, right? I won Sui, and there's tons of layer ones, right? So a lot of common questions I get is why layer one? And it kind of makes sense, right? Like if you think about most builders right now, like they only want to build if they believe that they have fame and fortune. If you look at history, it's really hard. It's very risky to take a bet on a new platform, right? Or a new chain, right? Because A, you don't know if they're going to even launch. B, like there's like a lot of things that, is it going to be stable? We know that every layer one says that they can get X thousands or X hundred thousands for speed on a TPS, but I don't know if anyone really understands that TPS number because it's a very controlled environment and it's a very simple transaction. As we all know, most transactions are not that, especially if you're sharing objects, not necessarily that simple, right? If it's a very complex smart contract, that's going to take a lot longer to reach finality versus something that's just like, I'm just sending something. It's like, I am just literally writing or paying something. So anyways, I think with that is that let's look at the front facing thing, right? So there's a lot of layer one. A lot of them have like, they have a lot of head start, right? So Ethereum, first smart contract platform, could be seen as first mover advantage. They have grown a big ecosystem. There's a lot of TVL in that particular platform. People hold Ethereum, tons of wallets, right? Probably the juggernaut, at least from this point of view. So Solana, if you look at NFTs, Polygon, especially in the gaming front, they're being very aggressive. So yes, there is, and then even for some of the emerging ones, right? Like I often hear about Near and Algorand. So yes, there are a ton of layer ones out there. And for a developer, it's very confusing because they don't know where to build. But most developers are looking at each of these platforms as ad inventory, honestly, because for them, they're kind of using it as user acquisition opportunities. But I think what that is, I think that's why it's really important to focus on what are the use cases that are actually going to be valuable to the end user, and why is Sui the only one going to be enabling those experiences. And then I think on the front end, there's also like the move chains, right, themselves. So we get a lot of comparisons with Aptos, like tons. I mean, if you look at the front-facing thing, both ex-Facebook, DM, engineering teams, founders, right, like it kind of does look like both led by very reputable VC firms, right? So I think in one respect, it does look kind of similar, right? But I always say dig a little deeper, because what I learned about, especially infrastructure or very deep tech plays, is that you really want to dig into like who is on the core founding team and who actually contributed in a specific way. Because if you come from a big company, I think a lot of people don't realize is that there's a lot of engineers, there's a lot of people, right? The way they make decisions, I mean, there's many different steps. There's an R&D team, there's a production engineering team. The engineering is not engineering. There's a difference between if you're an R&D security engineer versus which are a lot more hardcore than like, I would say like a typical, I'm just trying to push something into production and maintain it, right? That basically means more mature code base. We know that it works and all that stuff. There's not a lot of creative problem solving when you're coming from the production end. So I would say for one hand, and this is just a general tip, if you are evaluating L1 chains and founders, you really want to understand how involved are they? What did they build? What was their background before it? What was their contribution? And it's going to become pretty obvious, I think, in my mind, but what their contributions and like what it is. I mean, you got to go as far deep as academic papers, especially for deep technology, like issues like this. And so I think, unfortunately, a lot of people haven't really done enough diligence. And I kind of like when I first started as an angel investor, right? Like I usually used to do not a lot of diligence, right? I used to go by this like reputable VC is leading the rounds, so it must be good. And then I realized, I was like, wait, this VC has so much money that they have to deploy everywhere, right? Like they don't actually care. While they do want to invest by teams and really big concepts, I mean, I don't think there's some really good VC venture funds that are out there. But on the most part, like they only need one out of the thousands that they invested in to hit like 100x, right? And for me, it's like, I don't have that big of a check as an angel investor, so I should be a little bit more careful or more focused on like I invest or where I or who do I think I'd select as the winner. When I think about competition, yes, there is a difference between what I think is perspective, like perception, but then there's also reality. And I think for me, like I'm just going to let the product speak for itself. And then when we get to mainnet, and I'm pretty much assure you like a year from now, it's going to be very different. So.
Roger that. Now, you spoke about more on Sui, its competition, and what it offers. But we also have an interesting question in regards to, even with L2s in the mix, there's still going to be a rather large learning curve and accessibility barriers. So how is Sui going to have a user-friendly and accessible gateway for ordinary gamers? Like, let's be real, there are a lot of people who have little to no Web3 wallet experience to get past this hurdle. So the big question really will be Sui and its user-friendliness and accessibility for, the regular gamer.
I think that's a good question. I do think blockchain technology is what's limiting blockchain technology from wider adoption is accessibility. And that's not just accessibility for end users. I also think it's accessibility for developers. And I'm just going to finish the last thought that I forgot to include on the competition piece is that if you really look at Solidity, people say Ethereum won. And if you look at the numbers, there are about 4,000 Solidity developers actively contributing to GitHub. By the way, there's a lot more engineers at Facebook. So if you kind of take things in perspective, like if you look at programming language and widespread adoption, JavaScript has 18 million. I wouldn't necessarily say Ethereum was one or anyone has won, right? And I think a lot of it is because blockchain is in dial-up era right now. So as soon as we hit broadband era, it's going to be a very different world. So I think that's addressing the developers front. And so the next thing with that is going to be the users front. I'm actually of the belief for games, some people say, who's going to be the next Supercell or the next King or maybe the next Blizzard of the Web3 gaming world. I'm of the belief that we're actually vastly underestimating traditional Web2 gaming companies and their ability to innovate. Because I think the best on user onboarding for any game is still free to play. And I think what happens for Web3 integration, it's going to come in as another revenue channel or another business or another monetization channel. And then also it's really going to affect more things outside of the game rather than in the game. So I think within the game, it does present more monetization opportunities for elder game players or those that I think are the big whales, and also a little bit more potential effect on LTV, which is lifetime value for players who spend a lot of time in the game, because now there's an expectation that they're going to have a lot more people. Because there's an expectation that they can extract value, they would want to pay more money because in the end of it, if they do want to leave the ecosystem, they can definitely get some of that back. So I think on one hand, it's the best onboarding experience isn't going to be a Web3 focused experience. It's going to be a free-to-play game just like anything else. The game is going to coach or guide people through. I don't think people are going to know that they're interacting with a Web3 feature to begin with. And I actually think that's when blockchain has reached widespread adoption.
It's almost subterfuge. It kind of lures you in without you suspecting it, so you don't really question it, and you go through with the process, and then you're already in the game, and you're basically enjoying the experience of the game as opposed to thinking of the mechanics.
Yeah, if you think about it, and I came from the mobile gaming world, right? Everyone has a mobile phone. There's no way you can beat that distribution. And I hate to say it, you still got to play by Apple and Google's rules. And so for the App Store, the way that I see it is people are going to use the mobile gaming distribution hubs as, their top end funnel. So basically their way of acquiring tons of users at the top end and increasing brand awareness, or just getting players in, right? And trying to game. Because ultimately, as I said, players are going to feel value if they feel like they're investing their time, not necessarily spending their time. And so you got to convince them that the experience is worth their time to begin with. So why put all of these unnecessary barriers, like having a wallet, acquiring an NFT, getting tokens? You're dead on arrival. So you're going to just have a smaller addressable market. And but that being said, I do think there's going to be games that are going to be perfectly fine and sustainable on 1,000 players and with a 10,000 NFTs, right? Those games do exist, right? I think a lot of people forget that there are games that, we had mobile games even when I was at Google Play that only had 1,000 daily active users, if at all. But each of those players were spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars, and it was a 3-person game studio team, right? That's enough to step, more than enough for a 3-person game developer studio to subsist on it. If 1,000 of their players are putting in $300 a month, that means they're making $300,000 a month for 3 people. That's pretty good. Well, that's before. With the cut, it's about, I would say, 30%, 210,000. But yeah, banking around 200,000 or something before, and then whatever just from your returning players alone, that's a pretty good business for a 3-person team, right? Especially if you didn't have to do a lot of marketing. So I think with a lot of that is, I do think the onboarding for the games, I don't think you have to reinvent the wheel for onboarding. I think the biggest thing is that what are the new engagement mechanisms for the elder player and those that have been invested so much time in your game, and how are you going to reward them? And then on top of that is if you are going to become cross-platform and potentially use your mobile game as your top-end user acquisition funnel, then how is the PC and the desktop web browser games going to contribute to that? I think people just have to think through more broadly on what their user experience should be, because you probably shouldn't tell them to mint an NFT or print a wallet until they're absolutely invested in your game.
So let's talk about some future plans for what game development will look like on Sui. Like, do we have plans for a game engine SDK to release in the future? You know, the two biggest ones that people have discussed previously are Unity and Unreal. So what does that look like in terms of roadmap for gaming?
I mean, I talked about accessibility for developers before, right? And so I have a belief that a platform needs to meet, a platform's ecosystem is healthy because any developer, no matter what stage or what comfort that they have the ability to build their vision and create fame and fortune, potentially hit fame and fortune onto that platform. One part of that, especially as I kind of see our portfolio strategy, do we want to see that as, you know, we need to get really good shining examples. So it's about how do we increase the probability that a fame and fortune case study can exist. So I think with that, it's kind of like, all right, like obviously finished applications and especially with games, they make great demos, they make really good areas where people can see examples of how things work. The other part of that is tools and services. So what I mean, and tools and services are, you know, each type of developer, especially in gaming, right, they have their own tech and tool stack. And game engines is one unique. Unity in particular is probably more of an interesting target to me versus Unreal, but I think they're both important in different ways. Unity has a much more diverse community. It's definitely leans a little bit more indie. A lot of the game studios that are kind of looking to go pivot into Web3, a lot of them do use Unity as the game engine, especially if you're on mobile. And the second part of that is that like Unity actually has the ability for developers to build up their own tools on top of the game engines, right? So there's actually another, I would say, marketplace like ecosystem of developer tools and applications that are built on top of either Unity or Unreal so that game developers can build their things. An example could be like multiplayer plugins. Another thing could be matchmaking plugins. And one other example could just be like physics, like for fluids, right? Like for water, basically. So, I mean, a lot of that is pretty hard to code. And so there's this community of developers that are actually adding like assets or different plugins, especially on top of Unity, in order to build out things. So I think for one, we do have actually on our engineering team, we have someone that was one of the senior engineer at Unity itself. And so I think the Unity plugin is going to be fairly straightforward, especially for kind of adding that to our SDK. Also, it's going to give us, I think, the biggest breadth of the game types and genres that we'd be looking for, right? Everything from a small game and even to like a AA, like more immersive. But on the other side, specifically for Unreal, it's really focused on the AAA game. And I think for me, that's definitely more of a long-term view, as those games tend to be, I think they have at least minimum 5 to 7 year development times, often your 10-year development times to get to a quality one wants. And it's definitely a bigger risk. So I think for us, the way we kind of view it is that like we probably going to see the most experimentation for a game developer that's on Unity rather than Unreal. But that being said, I mean, there's a few game projects we're looking at that are definitely on Unreal and also building tool sets and evaluating how Web3 would work inside their game, especially in the more RPG genre.
I think what's also important to disclose is you did say at the very beginning that the game development process itself is also super complex. It's one of the hardest things that you can accomplish. In that same vein, what I want to kind of reiterate back to the audience is the fact that, hey, like every time there's a new technology, a new programming language, everything else that goes into it, other external third-party developers, whether it's working with an engine like Unity or it's working with a major AAA or even indie game studio, there is an onboarding process for their internal teams as well to get situated so that they feel confident that all the tools, everything internally is set before they can even fully begin to develop against it. So the roadmap for a AAA title, as far as I'm aware, and Koh definitely step in and let me know if it's wrong, is that it will be a much longer roadmap because there will be a lot of hiccups, beta testing that, you know, developers, studios have to do before they feel super confident going forward with a public-facing game that has their name on it that's particular to blockchain, you know, Web3 gaming.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because, I mean, it also shows, like, how much, and, like, that's, like, what we're here for, right? My personal social, right, is I try to educate people on, like, the realities of the game's business itself. Not only on, like, how long it takes to produce a game. I mean, there's a running joke right now. It's like, let's suppose, like, a game takes 12 months, which never happens, by the way. But if a game takes 12 months, a prototype only takes 1 month. The rest of that time is polished. It's literally 11 months. So I think a lot of people underestimate the timeline and that it takes to build a really good experience, which, unfortunately, personally, I think for achievements and a lot of these projects, like promising like world and games, right? I've always kind of laughed at them. I always kind of laugh a little bit, not at them per se, but I laugh a little bit because it's like I see their timelines and they're saying, oh, we're going to mint, and then like 3 quarters later, which is only they're going to have a game. Because I was like, dude, I don't know what game you can build that you are proposing in 9 months, right? This is a lot more complicated than that. I mean, mobile games take time to prototype, but even then they go through phases of beta testing even to make sure that the retention metrics are okay, right? You're telling me that you're going to have a full game ready in 9 months? Yeah, no. I would totally not believe that, right? Because I do think it's important. I think it's more important when you look at games teams is I look at games teams with actual real games experience, like actually building shipping games. And on top of that, there's different functions that you need to exist, and you need teams that work together before. Because as I said, these are very highly complex consumer applications that you have to ship that requires multiple functions. And if these functions, especially if you look at a team like a ragtag team from really cool, probably really cool brands, right? But if they've never worked together before and they're trying to ship an MMORPG, which is also one of the hardest games you can ever build, probably not going to even ship. But I think what that's bringing an interesting point about how we think about our portfolio. And so, like, I don't want to divulge too much details, and that's why. And I think it's kind of similar to approach to when you talk to any game investor, right? I think it's kind of like we're already very well aware that it takes not only time to build a game, but then also it may take multiple tries. And then on top of that, you're also at the mercy of how good your user acquisition and community building strategy is. Because in the end, like, it depends on, like, if you can get the distribution, right? Like, you know, they often say, like, you know, great technology may not always win, but good stories rarely lose. It applies even if you have the best game in the world, right? Like, if no one knows about it. That's why I think the community side is important. And I think, like, some of the stuff we see in blockchain technology and how it's going to empower and enable the fan base of a lot of these games and the players is going to be really interesting. How do they contribute to even giving active feedback on, like, how the game gets developed? But on top of that, you know, marketing and, like, also, like, telling their friends about the game. And now you have blockchain that can potentially, the transparency is what's going to allow, like, this fan is actually a big evangelist, right? Like, we should drop them token or maybe an NFT and to reward their ability for bringing in, like, these other players because we can essentially track it. They know your active wallet address. It's all public. So I think that's what's going to be really interesting is I think game developers and companies are going to have more transparency about the players themselves, thus able to build more direct relationships.
Cool. And also, I'm noticing that there's some additional questions popping up, but what do you think are the mainstream issues that affect mainstream gamers that blockchain gaming can solve? Just so you know, that bonus question you've already answered in regards to community. So we're going to dive back into some of the other aspects of development, which is, are there plans to create a store or a marketplace where people can discover Sui games?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, like, a couple of marketplaces. I think on one hand, the market projects are really interesting because I think they are a key component of any ecosystem. But it's interesting when I talk to game companies. So game companies, what I think that have more ambitious projects, having a third-party marketplace wasn't really in their, I guess, planning per se, because their belief is that almost all the economic activity should be within the game itself rather than be taken outside the game. And they see the third-party marketplaces as kind of like a user acquisition channel per se. So people feature, like, a really famous store that's cost, like, thousands upon thousands of dollars due to its rarity or due to its power-ups, right? Like, it's almost like it's a good sales point of, like, something that's, like, really unique versus just having a bunch of, like, 10-cent items that are kind of worthless listed on the store. I think a lot of it is that the way that we kind of see our store strategy is that, like, I think, we are working with more third-party projects. We're definitely talking to a lot of, I would say, non-Nistan/Sui companies that are looking to build marketplaces, or whether there are either wanted to support the chain as another chain or maybe kind of make an exclusive destination, kind of similar to what Magic even did for Solana. It was a destination for Solana NFTs. But we also have a few marketplace projects that are looking to be multi-chain, right? But then they're focused entirely on gaming. So I think it'll be, like, really interesting to kind of see that. Maybe we'll create our own, but I mean, I'm of the opinion that we should be a platform rather than an app developer because, I mean, building a marketplace is one thing, managing it and growing it is another thing. And I think that's where we would like to collaborate with third-party new developers, maybe potentially in the audience to kind of to help us build some of those experiences.
We'll see some incentives to get more people to build upon Sui in the future. Another question we received is actually, have you found that developers are scared of Sui due to it being built on Move and them not having familiarity with the language?
Not really, and I'm going to talk about why Move was created to begin with, which I'm sure you've heard from Sam multiple times if you've kind of been tuning into AMAs. So, like, Move was designed to be, I mean, it's an object-oriented programming smart contract language, And the reason why it was designed to be object-oriented is that's where most Web 2 is object-oriented programming languages, right? Literally is actually a pretty hard language to learn if you're coming from scratch. I mean, the reason why PEEP exists is now that there's a lot of people who have, over time, have done a lot of experimenting and figured out what are kind of the proper ways to, or at least figured out that it's smart contracts. Like if there was a few things, I mean, I always kind of say, and I don't blame them, developers are kind of lazy. If code already exists, why reinvent the wheel? They're just going to copy paste and then adjust it. So I know, like, don't worry, I kind of sometimes do the same thing, but it's kind of like, yeah, because the code is vetted and like, I mean, for minting an NFT, right? Like it should be, I mean, after a while, it's going to look pretty similar. So I think what I think that's interesting is that like, from what I found from Move so far, from developers, those coming from Solana, a lot of projects, they were able to get up prototypes on Sui within less than 2 days. And this is coming from Solana. That's been on average. I've never seen, for them, it was pretty straightforward. And they were like, oh, like we also like figured out what features that we already played with. And so, yeah, that was pretty stunning. We also had feedback from experienced Solidity developers evaluating Move versus Rust. Rust is a smart contract link, which is commonly used for Solana. For experienced Solidity developers going to Move, we've heard it only took them 5 to 6 days versus 6 weeks for Rust and going on Solana. And also like Move is designed to be a cross-platform language. One of these chains, EVMs included, like Celo, run low-level virtual. So if you know Move, a lot of the basic functionality should still apply even for those chains. And so I think like the flexibility and also the ease of learning from an experienced smart contract developer all the way to a newbie just starting out, but they came from the Web 2 world, it's going to be really exciting to see how many people become Move developers, right? Just because it's a lot more accessible and more straightforward to learn.
Perfect. Well, the last question that I'm at least seeing in our thread is, can you share information on the possibility of creating mobile Android games as an app and not as a web browser?
I think I mentioned this before, but I think for games in particular, like you probably have to create a mobile version, and understand like acquisition and attribution. Attribution being where it comes from, like where's the source of the traffic. And when you're in an app, right, like, and if you think about it, people are living in an app world, right? They're not living in a website world. So to some extent, and like also like the best experiences are always going to be applications on mobile. They're not going to be mobile web apps. But that's just my personal belief on it too. So like it's hard to unlearn it. Hard for people to learn new behaviors. I've learned this from launching products. What you need to do is to figure out, okay, for things that they do, how do you make a behavior that's sticky but not a huge hurdle for them to do, right? And in most cases, it's probably just integrated in things they already do to begin with.
So we have a little bit of time left. I do want to give you some time to close it with, your final thoughts, things that you want people to have as takeaways before we close out the AMAs.
I guess like for the, final takeaways in terms of like, I know I haven't talked about game projects per se. I promise it's coming, but like we're not ready yet. So, but there's a lot of cool things we're looking at. So I would say the biggest thing is that, Sui is up on testnet. I do want to thank everyone that's here, like in the community and really getting excited about Move, the programming language, and then also Sui as a layer 1. We're really excited to be here and be building this all together. And also just helping developers succeed, because in the end, we're building platforms to see our builders succeed, right? It's not really about builders like yourselves that are out here, because we have a belief in a decentralized future. And I think for those that are very interested in the gaming world, especially, right, I think the gaming is a pretty good Trojan horse to get more people to understand and get excited about Web3 technology. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how our ecosystem develops.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time, Ko. I'm sure this will not be the first or last, or it is the first, it won't be the last of our gaming sessions. I think as we are able to disclose, future partners, we'll probably have a lot more sessions where we can deep dive into the actual process. Well, in that case, thank you so much, everyone. Happy, goodbye, good morning, good night. We'll also share the recording and blog transcript. I know that some people have tagged me saying that we're late with the transcripts. We're fully aware. We'll have them released very soon. And we'll also make sure that we consolidate all of the recordings in an easy central place for you to access. So in that case, thank you so much and have a great rest of your day, morning, evening, afternoon.